My name is Madeline Carter. I am 29 years old, and 3 days before my wedding everything began to unravel. It started inside a boutique where my sister smiled sweetly, before pushing me so hard I hit the floor, my arm breaking in a snap I will never forget. When I begged for help, my mother pulled the phone from my hand and whispered not to call the police because Clarissa had a future. That was the moment I realized I had been cast aside. Soon after my wedding dress vanished, the ceremony I planned turned into her birthday party, and a fake email in my name told every guest that I had canceled the celebration. Even the man I thought I would marry chose silence. I was left broken, erased, and branded dramatic. But why did they need me gone so badly, and how far would I have to go before the truth came crashing down? Stay with me because the answer is not what anyone expected. But let me take you back to where it began in Charleston 3 days before the wedding. I woke up in Charleston thinking the air felt different, softer, somehow like the city was giving me one last quiet gift before the storm of the big day. I had worked for months on every detail, but more than anything, I had poured my heart into the dress. Every seam, every stitch was mine. I had imagined slipping into it, standing before the mirror, and for once in my life feeling entirely myself. The boutique on Meeting Street was called Magnolia Grace, an old converted chapel with tall stained glass windows and polished wood floors. It smelled faintly of lavender sachets and cedar polish. I had chosen it because it felt timeless and steady, everything my family had never been. When I walked in, Clarissa was already there. She looked like she had stepped out of a lifestyle magazine, hair curled just enough to look careless, but perfect pearl earrings catching the light white blazer tailored to flatter her every angle. She was my younger sister by 2 years, though no one ever treated her as younger. Clarissa was the golden one, the bright star. I was the one who worked in the shadows, sewing my own dress while she posed in every family photograph. I heard her voice before she turned her head. She was speaking to one of the girls who worked at the boutique, a polite smile on her lips. She said, "Madeline is always running behind artistic types, you know." The girl laughed softly, not realizing the sting buried in the words. Clarissa did not even look at me when I entered. I bit down on the retort sitting on my tongue. Today was supposed to be about joy. I followed the boutique owner toward the fitting room, the ivory gown already waiting for me on a dress form. It shimmered under the overhead lights like liquid silk. I had kept it simple, clean lines, a scalloped neckline, no heavy beading or lace. It was everything I had ever wanted, a piece of myself turned into fabric. I stepped into the gown with trembling hands, the fabric cool against my skin. Clarissa lingered by the mirror, phone in hand, her reflection layered beside mine like a ghost. I tried to ignore the way her eyes followed every movement. "Here, let me zip you," she offered, her tone light. I hesitated, then nodded. She tugged the zipper up, but tighter than necessary, the fabric biting into my ribs. "Careful," I whispered, adjusting the neckline. She did not respond. I reached down to slide my heel into place. The stool I meant to sit on was a few steps away, but I thought I could manage standing. I bent slightly, fingers grazing the buckle. Then it happened. A hard shove at my shoulder, sharp and sudden. My balance faltered. My foot twisted. The world tilted before I could grab onto anything. The crack that followed did not sound real. It was wet and hollow all at once, echoing up my arm and through my skull. For a second, I could not breathe, then the scream ripped out of me, raw and high, tearing through the quiet boutique. My right arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, pain surging like fire under my skin. I gasped for air, clutching at nothing. The girls who worked there rushed in, voices frantic, one of them calling for an ambulance. I could barely hear them over the roar in my ears. Clarissa stood a few feet away, hands half raised, her expression wide-eyed and innocent. "Did you trip, Maddie?" she asked, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. I could not answer. The pain swallowed words whole. The boutique owner knelt beside me, pressing a towel to my arm, trying to keep me still. Someone touched my shoulder and told me help was on the way. I fought to keep from fainting, eyes swimming in and out of focus. Through the blur, I saw Vera walk in. My mother. Her steps were quick, but her face was unreadable, lips pressed into a thin line. She did not kneel, did not ask where it hurt. She went straight to me and leaned down. "Give me your phone," she said flatly. I croaked out that I needed to call, but she pulled it from my hand before I could finish. "No police," she hissed so only I could hear. "Do not make this worse. Clarissa has a future." For a moment I thought I was hallucinating from the pain, but the hard look in her eyes told me she meant every word. She was not worried about my broken arm, not worried about my wedding. She was worried about Clarissa's resume. The sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder, the sound of help threading through my haze. I stared up at the stained glass windows, colors blurring into streaks. I realized in that moment that my family was not protecting me. They were burying me. And I had never felt more alone. The paramedics rushed in, voices calm and steady as they lifted me onto the stretcher. The boutique tilted above me, light scattering across the floor. My arm throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat. Clarissa stood near the counter, her hand resting lightly on her chest, eyes still wide. To anyone else, she looked like a concerned sister. To me, she looked like someone who had finally won. As they wheeled me out into the sunlight of Charleston, I understood that the pain in my arm was only the beginning. The ride in the ambulance blurred into a haze of sirens and the metallic sting of oxygen in my nose. I could hear the paramedics talking, but their words slid past me, only fragments catching in my ears. Fracture, swelling, surgery. I held onto the stretcher like it might stop the world from spinning. At the hospital, the lights were brighter, harsher, every surface smelling of antiseptic. They cut the sleeve of my dress away, scissors snipping close to my skin, and I felt exposed in a way that was worse than the pain. Nurses moved quickly, steady hands, pressing IVs into veins, voices reassuring me in tones I could not believe. When the doctor finally leaned over me, his glasses catching the glare, I searched his face for hope. "You will need surgery tonight," he said calmly, like he was reading off a list. "The fracture is severe. We will insert pins to stabilize the bone." My throat went dry. I asked if I would be able to draw again, to sew, to use my hand. He paused for a beat too long. 6 weeks minimum for healing. Even then you may need therapy. It could be longer. The words stabbed deeper than any needle. 6 weeks meant no final touches on my wedding dress, no sketches, no control. My work had always been in my hands, and now my hands had been taken from me. They wheeled me into surgery before I could think too hard. The anesthesia rushed cold through my veins, and I sank into darkness, grateful for the escape. When I woke, the room was quiet except for the low hum of machines. My right arm was swallowed in thick white plaster, elevated on pillows. A heavy ache throbbed through it, dull but insistent. Outside the window, Charleston's skyline glowed in the fading evening light, pastel rooftops fading into shadow. For a brief second I thought maybe someone would be sitting beside me. But the chair was empty. A few hours later, Vera appeared. She set her purse down carefully, her heels clicking against the tile. She did not look at the monitors or ask if I needed water. She studied my face as if weighing how much I might say. "This has been enough drama, Madeline," she finally said. "You should consider a smaller ceremony. Do not make a scene out of this. People will talk." I blinked at her, pain and disbelief knotting together in my chest. I told her Clarissa shoved me. That it was not an accident. Her eyes narrowed, then softened into that patronizing look I knew too well. "Clarissa is under a lot of stress," she said. "She has a future, a reputation. Do not drag her name through the mud." So my wedding was expendable, my arm a sacrifice, so long as Clarissa kept her shine. I turned my face to the window, unable to look at her anymore. Vera gathered her purse again and said she would check on me tomorrow. Her perfume lingered long after the door clicked shut. I waited for Ethan. My fiancé, the man who had promised to be my partner in everything. I thought maybe his car had broken down, maybe he was stuck in a meeting. Hours passed. My phone lit up once with a message, just a line. "Tied up at work. Sorry." That was all. The ache in my arm pulsed harder. I pressed the phone to my chest, staring at the ceiling until my eyes burned. Nurses came and went, adjusting fluids, checking vitals. None of them noticed the hollow space that grew larger by the minute. By the next afternoon, I had memorized the cracks in the ceiling tiles. Sunlight streamed across the floor, and I lay there watching dust swirl in its path. My body felt heavy, pinned not only by plaster but by silence. I tried to picture walking down the aisle with Ethan at my side. Instead, all I saw was Clarissa's smirk. Out of habit, I reached for my phone with my left hand. Notifications glowed. I tapped through each one, hitting harder than the last. Clarissa's Instagram story filled the screen. A picture of her hand nails, painted scarlet fingers curled around a tube of matching lipstick. On the floor beside her, a pair of stiletto heels, one angled like it had just stepped into place. The caption read just a red shoe emoji, and nothing more. To anyone else, it was a fashion post. To me, it was a confession. A message only I would understand. She wanted me to know. My throat closed. I stared at the screen until the image blurred, fury and heartbreak tangling in a way that made me shake. She had broken my arm, shattered my work, left me in this bed, and now she was flaunting it as if it were an accomplishment. I set the phone down carefully on the tray beside me. The monitor ticked steadily at my side, reminding me I was still alive. I closed my eyes, the picture burned behind my lids. I had thought the worst was behind me. I knew now it was only beginning. 2 days after the surgery, they discharged me with a sling, pain pills, and a warning not to strain my right arm under any circumstances. The ride back to my parents' house felt like being driven into a memory I had tried to outgrow. Charleston streets rolled by, pastel houses framed with iron gates, blooming magnolias bending low in the heat. Each turn toward the familiar neighborhood made my chest feel tighter. The Carter house stood the same as always, white shutters, a porch with rocking chairs and flower beds. Clarissa never touched but always posed in front of for pictures. When I stepped inside, the first thing that hit me was the wall in the foyer. Every frame held Clarissa's face. Clarissa at her college graduation. Clarissa at charity galas. Clarissa with Vera, both smiling as if the world bent for them. I searched automatically for myself. Nothing. Not a single picture of me in sight. I climbed the stairs carefully, my sling brushing against the railing. My arm ached with each step. In the living room, Vera sat cross-legged on the sofa with a bridal magazine spread across her lap. The glossy cover reflected the light photos of gowns I recognized from designers I admired. She looked up only briefly when I entered. "You are back," she said without lifting her eyes from the page. I lowered myself into a chair across from her. My body still felt fragile, like one wrong move could undo the work of the surgeons. I asked her if she had spoken to Ethan. She pursed her lips. "He called me," she said. "He is busy but thinking of you." Busy. That word tasted bitter now. I told her I wanted to check on my dress. She turned a page slowly, the rustle deliberate. "That has already been handled," she said. "Do not stress yourself." The sharpness of her tone made me pause. I asked what she meant. She looked up then, her eyes cool. "The gown is being taken care of. Focus on resting." The way she said it made me feel like a guest in my own life. My dress was the one thing I had poured myself into stitches, lined with every late-night fabric, draped and redraped until it reflected me. Now it had been reduced to something managed without me. I stayed quiet, but unease spread through me. After Vera left the room, I moved slowly toward the dining table where a pile of envelopes and stationery lay scattered. Pain jolted up my arm when I reached for them, but I used my left hand to shuffle through. The invitations stopped me cold. I knew the design well because I had approved it months ago, ivory cardstock with silver trim. But these looked different. The names on the list were not the ones Ethan and I had carefully chosen. Some of my closest friends were gone. In their place were names I barely recognized, acquaintances from Clarissa's world, people she posted pictures with at rooftop bars and beach parties. I stared at the paper until the words blurred. My chest grew heavy, as if something vital had slipped through my fingers without me noticing. Clarissa's handwriting was scrawled in notes across the guest list, arrows and checks that marked it as hers. The realization struck hard. This was not a mistake or a misprint. Someone had deliberately altered the wedding. My wedding. I sat down again, the invitations clutched to my chest. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of it. Ethan had not come to see me, Vera was evasive, and now the guest list had shifted into something unrecognizable. Every sign pointed to a truth I did not want to admit. The house was quiet, only the sound of a clock ticking in the hallway. I looked around at the frames on the walls, Clarissa's face everywhere smiling down at me. A wave of dread settled deep inside. It was not just my arm they had taken from me. Piece by piece they were taking the wedding itself. I closed the stack of invitations and slid them back into place, my fingers trembling. A dark certainty bloomed in me. Something was being rearranged behind my back, and if I did not find out what it was, there would be nothing left of the day I had been building toward for years. I leaned back in the chair, my arm heavy in its sling, and let the fear sit inside me. The signs were too clear to ignore now. My wedding was no longer mine, and the people closest to me were letting it happen. I woke up the next morning to the dull throb in my arm, each pulse a reminder of how far everything had slipped away from me. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in pale stripes, catching the dust in the air, and for a moment I let myself pretend things were normal, that the weekend ahead would still belong to me. But habit forced my hand. I reached for my phone with my left hand fumbling as the sling tugged at my shoulder and opened Instagram. The first post that appeared froze the blood in my veins. It was the Whitmore Hall ballroom, glowing with chandeliers, walls dripping with roses, the same shade of blush I had spent hours choosing. The caption read, "Happy birthday, Clarissa, born to shine." My breath caught. I scrolled further, each swipe another knife. The arrangements I had chosen, the long tables draped in white linens, the arches of flowers, all of it was there. Only it was not my initials on the banner, but a glittering slogan, "Born to shine." The stage was Clarissa's. There she stood in the photos, a sequined gown hugging her frame hair in perfect curls, a glass of champagne raised high. Around her were the very guests who had vanished from my list. They were laughing, clapping, celebrating her as if my wedding had been nothing more than a rehearsal for this. And then I saw Vera, my mother, who had told me to tone things down, who had begged me not to call the police. She was in the center of one photo, her arm linked with Clarissa's, their smiles identical. The caption read, "Clarissa always shines." I gripped the phone so tightly my good hand ached. I scrolled again and again, desperate for a mistake, for a sign that maybe I had misread, but there was no mistake. The hall I had booked, the plans I had made, the money I had spent, all had been stolen and repurposed into my sister's stage. I felt the floor tilt under me. My throat burned, my stomach churned. I could almost see myself walking into that room in my dress, vows trembling on my lips, only to be greeted by balloons and banners celebrating Clarissa. The humiliation would have been complete. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like hours, my sling weighing heavy, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was not only the theft of a venue or flowers or guests, it was the theft of my reality. By afternoon, I forced myself to sit at the dining table, laptop open, the glow reflecting off my pale skin. My fingers trembled as I searched my inbox, needing proof, needing an explanation. Then I saw it. In my sent folder sat an email I had never written. My heart stopped. It was addressed to every guest, every vendor. The subject line was short and brutal: wedding ceremony canceled. My vision blurred as I clicked it open. The message was cold, almost clinical. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the wedding of Madeline Carter and Ethan Whitfield will no longer take place. We apologize for any inconvenience. It was signed with my name. I could not breathe. I had never typed those words. I had never even seen this message before. Yet the digital trail said it had come from me. Panic spread through me as I scrolled the details. Then I saw it. The address was almost identical to mine, a single letter swapped so subtle most people would never notice. Someone had created a fake account. Someone had crafted this message, sent it to every person who mattered, and erased my wedding with a single keystroke. Tears blurred the screen as I realized what that meant. To everyone else, it looked like I had canceled. No one would question it. No one would call. They would simply move on. I sat frozen, my good hand pressed against the cool table. Every ounce of betrayal that had been whispered before was now written in bold print. My own family had not only taken my body down but had gone inside my life and deleted me. The sling pulled at my shoulder, grounding me in the pain that had started it all. Clarissa's push had broken more than bone. It had broken the fragile illusion that I mattered to them. I closed the laptop, my breath jagged. The silence of the house closed in around me, heavy and suffocating. Later that evening, I forced myself to eat something, though each bite turned to sand in my mouth. My phone buzzed on the counter, and with shaking hands, I unlocked it. More posts. More photos of Clarissa, her lipstick flashing under the lights, Vera kissing her cheek, captions flooded with praise. One in particular made me gasp. A short video clip of Clarissa raising her glass, smiling slyly at the camera. Behind her, the banner glittered. She tapped her foot against the floor, lifting it just enough for everyone to see the red sole of her heel. She tilted her head and mouthed words that made my blood turn to ice. Mine now. The comments beneath roared with laughter and praise, but I understood. It was meant for me. I dropped the phone onto the counter, my knees weak. The message could not have been clearer. She had taken everything, and she wanted me to know. I staggered back to my room, clutching the sling against my chest. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, every nerve on fire. My wedding had been stolen, my name had been forged, my life rewritten. But beneath the grief, something colder began to stir. It was not the end. It was only the latest move in a game I had never agreed to play. And I was not done yet. I woke the next morning with the laptop still on the coffee table and the phone slipping halfway off the cushion. My body ached from sleeping, twisted around my sling, but it was nothing compared to the sharp hollowness inside my chest. Sunlight crept through the blinds, slanting across the room, and for a moment I thought maybe I had dreamed it all. Maybe Ethan was still mine, Elena still trusted me, and Clarissa was just a reckless younger sister who would eventually grow up. But the laptop waited, black screen like a shut door hiding the filth behind it. The phone buzzed with more silence than messages, the absence of comfort louder than anything else. I forced myself upright, cradling my arm, and opened the computer again. Part of me hoped the messages had vanished overnight, some digital error corrected by time. Instead, they glared at me in neat lines of betrayal. Clarissa's words. Ethan's replies, flirtations hidden in casual tones. And one message from just a week earlier where she had written, "Don't worry, soon she won't be in the way." I slammed the laptop closed before I could throw up. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds from yesterday. I poured water, the glass clinking against the counter as my left hand fumbled. My phone buzzed again. A new message. I snatched it up, praying it was Elena, an apology, anything. But it was Clarissa, her Instagram story now pushed to the top of my feed. She had posted a picture of Ethan's cufflinks sitting on a marble countertop, the kind he wore only for important occasions. The caption read, "Some things are meant for those who know how to use them." A red heart followed by a winking face. I wanted to hurl the phone across the room. Instead, I sank to the floor, my good hand pressed against my forehead. She wanted me to see it. She wanted me to feel small, unwanted, erased. I couldn't breathe until I called Vera again. This time my voice cracked with desperation as I told her everything, the emails, the cufflinks, the taunts. There was a pause, and then her voice cool and flat. Madeline, families survive by keeping things quiet. Do not dig into the past. Clarissa is young. Ethan is confused. It will pass if you let it. If I let it. Mom, they are destroying me. Do you not care? I care about what people think of this family, she answered sharply. You have always been too dramatic. The line clicked, and the silence after burned worse than her words. I walked back into the living room and stared at the blank television. My body shook with a cold that no blanket could fix. The betrayal doubled on itself until I felt hollowed out. I needed someone who believed me, anyone. I opened my messages to Elena again, typing one last desperate plea. Please come see me. I will show you the laptop myself. I need you. Hours passed. No response. By late afternoon, exhaustion dragged at my limbs. I dozed on the couch, dreams fractured with images of Ethan's smile turned sharp. Clarissa's hands pushing me, Vera's eyes cold. When I startled awake, the room was dark, except for the glow of my phone. A message. From Elena. I clicked it open, my heart leaping. But it was only a single line. I can't, Maddie. You have to handle this yourself. The tears blurred the words until they dissolved into light. I pressed the phone to my chest, rocking slightly as if I could comfort myself the way no one else would. The clock ticked past midnight. The apartment felt less like a home and more like a cell. I could almost hear Clarissa's laughter in the silence, her voice echoing in every shadow. They had taken my wedding, my fiancé, my friend. Piece by piece, they were stripping away everything I thought I was. But beneath the weight of grief, a spark caught. It flickered faintly at first, then steadier. They had broken my arm, tried to break my spirit, and stolen the people I loved. Yet I was still here. I was still breathing. And I would not let them erase me. I stood slowly, clutching the sling tighter, and turned the laptop back on. This time, I was not reading to wallow. I was searching. Every message, every timestamp, every digital breadcrumb. If no one believed me, then I would gather proof so undeniable it would burn through their lies. For hours, I scrolled screen after screen until dawn bled into the sky. Betrayal had taken everything from me. But it had also given me something new, a reason to fight. The call came just as I was pouring a cup of coffee into a chipped mug. My uncle's voice was steady, but the words cracked through me like glass shattering. Grandma Rose was gone. For a moment, I could not breathe. The apartment went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. My legs folded under me, and I sank onto the couch, clutching the phone. She had been the only one who never doubted me, the only person who looked past the chaos and saw me for who I really was. The funeral was scheduled quickly. St. Agnes Chapel on Broad Street, the white steeple I had passed 1,000 times without thinking it would ever hold her casket. The morning of the service, Charleston air clung heavy and damp. I dressed carefully, black dress buttoned with one hand, the other strapped stiff in its sling. My reflection looked hollow, but I pressed lipstick onto my lips anyway. Grandma would have told me to keep my chin up even now. The chapel was crowded, rows filled with neighbors, church friends, and distant relatives I barely recognized. The scent of lilies pressed thick in the air. I moved to the side aisle, my chest aching, and tried to steady myself. I had written words the night before. Simple words from my heart, hoping to speak for the woman who had raised me on stories of strength when no one else cared. When I approached Vera about reading, her eyes narrowed. She adjusted the pearl pin on her blazer and shook her head. "Do not make a scene, Madeline. Your grandmother deserves peace, not your drama." I swallowed hard, voice low. "It is not drama." She was my anchor. Her lips pressed thin. "Sit down, do not ruin this." The ache in my arm flared, but I held my ground. Yet before I could step forward again, Clarissa swept down the aisle in a fitted black dress, face perfectly made up as if for a gala instead of a funeral. The pastor nodded and to my horror handed her the microphone. She cleared her throat, tears shimmering at the edges of her lashes, though I could not tell if they were real. Her voice rang sweet and sure, filling the vaulted ceiling. She spoke of love, of family, of tradition. She called Grandma the heart of the Carters, the woman who taught them everything about grace. She painted a portrait so polished it almost sounded believable. But I knew the truth. Clarissa had ignored Grandma for months, too busy chasing her own spotlight. She had mocked her old-fashioned advice, brushed off her calls. And now she stood here claiming a closeness she never earned. I gripped the wooden pew nails, digging into the varnish. My notes crumpled in my good hand, pages I had poured myself into, pages no one would ever hear. The words stuck in my throat until I tasted copper. The congregation nodded along, tears dabbing at their cheeks, swept up in her performance. Vera beamed from the front row, pride swelling in her eyes. My mother's pride, never for me, always for Clarissa. When the speech ended, applause broke out, softly, polite but approving. Clarissa stepped down, her heels sharp against the wooden steps. She moved toward me, smile gentle for the crowd. Then, as she leaned close, her whisper sliced straight through the fragile quiet. "Try it and see." My blood chilled. She brushed past, perfume clinging heavy in her wake, and slipped back beside Vera, who clasped her hand with satisfaction. I stood rooted, unable to speak as the pastor moved on with the closing prayers. My chest rose and fell, a storm trapped under ribs. After the service, mourners drifted out into the courtyard, the bells tolling overhead. I stood by the stone wall, eyes fixed on the sunlight filtering through moss-draped oaks. A neighbor clasped my shoulder with sympathy, but her words blurred into static. I could not hear anything over Clarissa's whisper replaying in my head. Try it and see. The challenge. The warning. The taunt. It was not enough that she had taken my wedding, my fiancé, my friend. Now she wanted to take even this, the last sacred moment, with the only person who had truly loved me. I clenched my jaw until it ached, grief and fury twisting together. She wanted me silenced. She wanted me erased. But standing there beneath the chapel bell, the air heavy with incense and loss, I promised myself I would not let her succeed. Not here. Not anymore. When I returned to my apartment that evening, the silence pressed heavy against me. The scent of funeral lilies clung to my clothes, and the black dress felt like it had fused to my skin. I set my bag down and went to the closet where a small cedar chest waited on the top shelf. It was the one Grandma Rose had promised me years ago, saying only that I would know when it was time to open it. The wood creaked as I dragged it down with my good arm. Dust floated through the dim light of the lamp as I eased open the lid. Inside lay a bundle of folded fabric scraps from dresses she had sewn, a string of pearls dulled with age, and beneath them a stack of envelopes tied with faded ribbon. My throat tightened when I saw my name written across the top envelope in her careful looping script. I slid it open with trembling fingers. The letter inside was brief but steady, every stroke of ink certain. You were born to break the cycle. Do not let them write the story for you. I pressed the page to my chest, tears spilling down without warning. In that moment, I felt her voice around me as if she were still in the room. She had seen it all long before I had, the favoritism, the silencing, the way Vera and Clarissa bent reality until I almost believed them. And still she had left me this, her last command. The letter became a weight and a weapon all at once. My broken arm throbbed, but my resolve hardened. I spent the next day going through the rest of the chest, piecing together the fragments she had left. Recipes, notes, even a faded program from her nursing graduation. Each piece reminded me of the strength she carried through a life where no one handed her anything. If she could carve her own path, I could too. That evening, my phone buzzed with a notification. At first, I almost ignored it, expecting another hollow condolence or Clarissa's smug display. But the name on the screen caught me. Lacey Moore. Lacey had been an acquaintance from design school in Savannah, more colleague than friend, but someone who had always been fair. She had seen some of my sketches in class years ago and once told me I had a rare voice in my work. We had not spoken in months. The message was short. Maddie, you need to see this. There was a link attached. I hesitated, my heart beginning to hammer. Then I clicked. A portfolio page opened on my screen, glossy and professional, carrying Clarissa's name in bold across the top. It was an application site, the kind students sent to universities or competitions. I scrolled down, my breath catching. There were my sketches. The lacework patterns I had spent nights refining. The mood board I had pinned together for my own wedding collection. The color palettes, the fabric swatches. Even the rough draft of the gown I had intended to wear at the altar. Every stroke was mine, every note in my handwriting scanned and repackaged as hers. The caption below each design credited Clarissa as the creator. And at the bottom, the application badge confirmed submissions to the University of Southern California's Graduate Design Program and to the National Design Showcase in New York. I felt sick. I scrolled further, images flashing past like punches to the gut. My art, my years of practice stolen and passed off under her name. She had not just taken my family, my fiancé, and my moment of grief. She had taken my work, the part of me that had nothing to do with her at all. My vision blurred as I clutched the phone, rage boiling through the cracks of sorrow. For years they had told me to be quiet, to stay small, to let Clarissa shine. But now there was proof. Proof that she was not shining at all. She was stealing the light and calling it her own. I read Lacey's note again. She had added one line beneath the link. Thought you should know before it gets bigger. I sat in the dark with the glow of the screen lighting my face, the letter from Grandma still spread on the table beside me. Her words burned into me. Do not let them write the story for you. This was my story. And it was time to take it back. The next morning I called Lacey. Her voice was cautious but firm. She had stumbled on Clarissa's portfolio through a shared connection and recognized the designs immediately. She remembered me showing her those sketches years ago in class. She knew they were mine. I thanked her my throat tight and asked if she would be willing to back me if it came to it. She hesitated, then agreed. She said it was not right and she would not lie if asked. When I hung up, I leaned back against the wall, heart racing. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faint spark of power in my hands again. Not enough to fix everything, not enough to heal the fracture in my arm or in my life, but enough to know I had a weapon. Clarissa had whispered, "Try it and see at the funeral." She had no idea how ready I was to do exactly that. I laid the printed pages across the dining table one by one, lining them up, so there could be no mistaking the names and dates at the bottom of each file. Sketches of silhouettes, fabric swatches, mood boards. I had spent months curating even the final rendering of my wedding dress, all copied directly into Clarissa's portfolio as if they had been born from her imagination. My hand trembled as I set the last page down, partly from the weight of the sling, partly from the rage that had no outlet. The sound of Vera's slippers shuffled down the hallway. She entered with her morning coffee, the steam curling lazily toward the ceiling, her face drawn tight from lack of sleep. She stopped when she saw the table covered with my work. I pushed the stack closer to her. My throat felt raw. "These are mine, every single one." Clarissa submitted them to USC to the National Showcase with her name on the cover. Vera glanced at the papers, but didn't bend down to read them. She sipped her coffee slowly, eyes lifting toward the window as if the garden outside deserved more attention than the evidence spread between us. After a long silence, she murmured, "Families share, Maddie. Clarissa only borrowed." Borrowed. The word cracked something inside me. I slammed my good hand against the table, the papers fluttering. Borrowed means you ask first. Borrowed means you return. She stole from me. Vera's face hardened, though her voice stayed calm, almost patronizing. "You always see yourself as a victim. Clarissa is building her career, her future. You should be proud she sees value in your work." Proud. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. The air in the room felt thick, pressing against my ribs. I whispered, "You're telling me to be proud that my sister broke my arm and stole my wedding?" Her eyes narrowed. "Lower your voice, Maddie. You've always had a flair for dramatics. Don't ruin everything with another scene." The words landed heavier than a slap. She turned away and walked into the kitchen, the faint clink of her spoon against the mug echoing like a door closing. I stared at the pages scattered on the table, my vision blurring. In that moment, I realized she would never see me. Not as a daughter, not as a designer, not as a person with worth of my own. That night alone in my childhood room, I stared up at the faded glow in the dark, stars still stuck to the ceiling. I felt like the same teenager who had once dreamed under them, desperate for freedom, desperate for someone to say I mattered. The silence of the house pressed in, and every creak of the wood reminded me I was surrounded by people who would rather bury me than lift me up. The next afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find a FedEx envelope propped neatly against the step. No knock, no voice, just the pale package waiting like an accusation. Inside was a check, $25,000, my name typed in crisp black ink. Beneath it lay a non-disclosure agreement, 4 pages of dense legal wording. The last sheet carried a signature line already filled with Vera's name in bold, her neat script smoothed into print. The blood drained from my face. It was not an invitation to talk or to heal, it was payment. I carried the envelope back to the table and sat down. My fingers brushed over the check, tracing the numbers. 25,000. To them, it was the price of my silence, the cost of erasing me. My entire career, my stolen designs, my broken arm, my humiliation, my vanished wedding, all distilled into 5 digits on a slip of paper. For a moment, I imagined depositing it. It could pay medical bills, cover rent, buy fabric, even keep me afloat while I figured out my next step. But the thought curdled quickly. Taking it would mean agreeing with them. It would mean accepting that my voice, my art, my life could be bought. I pulled Grandma Rose's letter from my bag, the paper worn soft at the folds. Break the cycle. Do not let them write the story for you. Her handwriting wavered, but the message burned steady. I laid the letter beside the check. One was love, the other was dismissal. One was belief, the other was bribery. The storm outside thickened, thunder rolling across Charleston's sky. Lightning flashed against the window, and for an instant, the reflection staring back at me was sharper, harder, someone I almost did not recognize. They thought I could be silenced with money. They thought I was weak enough to trade truth for comfort. I set the check down, smoothing it flat against the table. My hands no longer shook. The anger that had consumed me for weeks cooled into something steadier, more dangerous. They wanted me quiet. Instead, they had given me fuel. The flames swallowed the last strip of paper, and I sat motionless, listening to the faint crackle until even that sound disappeared. All that remained was a bed of ash gray and brittle, just like the trust I had once carried for the people who claimed to be my family. My hand shook as I shut the fireplace screen, but it was not fear anymore. It was adrenaline. A current of fire raced beneath my skin, stronger than the throb in my broken arm. I gathered every box, every folder I had shoved into closets and under my bed. Years of sketches lay before me, rolled up in tubes pinned to corkboards, taped in journals that still smelled faintly of graphite and perfume. I spread them across the living room floor like a mosaic of my life. Each drawing carried my handwriting, each corner stamped with dates. Some even had coffee stains from nights when exhaustion nearly drowned me. They were mine in every way. I began taking photos of everything one by one, my phone clicking steadily into the silence. Close-ups of pencil marks, wide shots of dress silhouettes, fabric swatches taped in neat rows. The more I documented, the steadier my hands became. It was as if each click of the camera stitched me back together where Clarissa had tried to tear me apart. The laptop came next. I opened email threads with vendors, contracts, confirming orders, even invoices stamped paid in full with my signature. I highlighted dates, saved PDFs, uploaded them to 3 separate drives. With my good hand, I labeled each file like a soldier preparing for battle venue, fabric sketchbook invitations. Every keystroke was a reminder that I was no longer the victim. I was the witness. Hours blurred. The clock on the wall read nearly 2 when I stumbled across the voice memo folder. Hundreds of files scrolled past, most just my own murmurs about hem lengths or ribbon samples. Then one leapt out at me. Hospital. My throat tightened as I tapped play. The sound of medical monitors filled the air, steady and cold. My own voice came next, weak, muddled with painkillers. Then a rustle of movement. And her. Clarissa's voice, sharp as broken glass. Of course I did it. She's not walking down that aisle before me. The world tilted. I pressed stop, then play again. The same words, the same cruel edge in her tone. I could see her in my mind, leaning close to my hospital bed, lips painted red, whispering venom because she thought I was too weak to remember. But I had remembered. My phone had remembered. I sank to the floor, clutching the device like it was a weapon. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel powerless. No matter what Vera said, no matter what excuses Ethan muttered, no one could erase this. It was not suspicion anymore. It was confession. I replayed it again and again until the words were etched into my skull. The fire's smoke still lingered faintly in the room, and as it curled around me, I felt the weight in my chest loosen. This was what justice looked like. Not the silence they demanded, not the check they waved like a gag. This. Proof. I rose and began layering everything together, stacking evidence like bricks. The sketches with my initials, the contracts with dates, the emails showing I had secured the vendors first. And now the recording. A confession clear enough that even a stranger would understand. At one point, my phone buzzed with a message from Elena. I ignored it. My hand hovered over Ethan's contact, but I did not press. I could not waste this on people who had already chosen to see me as dramatic or unstable. The evidence was not for them. It was for me. For the law. For the truth that no one could bury. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Outside, Charleston streets were silent, damp with the salt air from the harbor. The whole house seemed to lean in toward me, listening. My cast itched, my body screamed for rest, but I kept working until I had 3 binders full of evidence and 2 drives tucked safely into my bag. When I finally sat down, the room felt different. Less like a cage, more like a war room. My grandmother's letter lay open on the coffee table, the words scrawled in her careful hand. "Do not let them write the story for you." I touched the ink with my fingertip as if she had written it for this exact night. For the first time since the boutique, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. I was no longer a woman clinging to scraps of dignity. I was a woman holding the match that could set their lives ablaze. Sleep never came. I sat awake staring at the evidence spread around me until dawn slipped pale and golden across the floor. Birds began to stir outside. My arm pulsed in its cast, my heart still raw, but beneath it all burned a steady flame. No one could laugh this away. No one could wave a check and expect me to vanish. I had gathered everything I needed. And this time there would be no silence. The morning air was cool and sharp as I walked up the stone steps of the Charleston Police Department with the weight of my bag pulling at my shoulder. Inside that bag sat every binder, every drive, every shred of proof I had collected. My broken arm ached with every step, but the pain only reminded me why I was there. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped into the fluorescent-lit lobby. The officer at the front desk looked up from her computer. Her badge read Parker. She gave me a polite smile, the kind strangers save for someone clearly carrying more than just paperwork. I told her my name and that I needed to file a report. When she asked what kind, I said quietly but firmly assault, fraud, and intellectual property theft. The words felt surreal as they left my mouth, yet liberating. Within minutes, I was seated at a gray metal desk in a small room with cinderblock walls painted beige. Detective Harris entered with a legal pad under his arm. He was in his late 40s, sharp eyes under tired lids, the kind of man who had heard every excuse. He shook my hand gently when he saw the sling. I slid the binders across the desk one after another. Sketches, contracts, emails, photographs, recordings. He leafed through them with the detached focus of a man who had seen hundreds of cases, but the longer he flipped, the slower his movements grew. When I played the hospital recording, his pen stopped mid-note. Clarissa's voice filled the small room, cold and clear. He set the pen down. "That's a direct admission." My throat tightened, but I nodded. I told him about the email cancellations, the check, the silence my family demanded. He wrote quickly, now questions short and precise. Dates, times, names. He asked about Ethan's involvement, and I told him about the messages I found, his absence at the hospital, the way he vanished when things collapsed. Harris finally leaned back, steepling his fingers. "We can file this under multiple counts. Assault causing bodily harm. Fraud through impersonation. Theft of intellectual property. With the recording and the supporting documents, this is no longer a family dispute. This is a criminal matter." Hearing it from his mouth settled something inside me. For weeks I had been gaslit into doubting myself, told I was dramatic, unstable, overreacting. Now it was ink on paper, black and white. He excused himself and left the room briefly. When he returned, he had a case folder with my name written on the tab. He slid it across the desk and said it was now officially open. By the time I stepped back outside into the Charleston sunlight, the city felt different. Not kinder, not safer, but real. Like the ground beneath my feet had finally stopped shifting. I sat on the steps for a long moment, hugging my bag, listening to traffic pass on Meeting Street. That night, restless, I opened Instagram and searched for Clarissa's account. My stomach twisted when the location tag glowed at the top of her latest story. Malibu, California. The photo showed her in oversized sunglasses, hair in perfect curls, champagne glass raised beside Ethan. He stood close, arm around her waist. The caption read, "Nothing can dim this light." I felt the heat rise to my face. While I was limping through grief and humiliation, they had fled across the country, sipping champagne on the Pacific coast. I took screenshots, every detail preserved. The next morning, I returned to the station and showed Detective Harris the posts. He frowned, noting the date and time stamps. He muttered that running across state lines did not erase liability. If anything, it complicated things in a way that worked against them. He said he would contact law enforcement in California. 2 days later, he called me in. His office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and paper. On his desk lay a document stamped with bold letters. Request for interstate assistance. Harris explained that Charleston PD had officially reached out to the Malibu Sheriff's Office. Because the crime spanned states and included electronic fraud, it was being escalated for federal review. The words struck like thunder. Federal. It meant this was bigger than my family's denials, bigger than Clarissa's theatrics. The system itself had stepped in now. I left the office with my cast heavy against my side, but for the first time in months, I walked without feeling small. The streets of Charleston bustled around me unaware, but I carried a secret they could not see. Justice had begun to move slowly, steadily, like a tide no one could stop. That evening, I sat at my grandmother's old writing desk, the letter she left me pinned above the lamp. Do not let them write the story for you. I pressed my hand to the ink and whispered a promise. The story was mine now. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail from Detective Harris. His voice was calm but decisive. He said Malibu had responded. Clarissa and Ethan were officially under investigation. I sat back on the bed, the phone still against my ear, and felt the tremor in my chest shift. Fear had lived there for too long. Now something else burned in its place. Resolve. The net was tightening, and for the first time, it was not me caught inside. The first images from Malibu hit my phone the way a slap does, sudden and stinging. Clarissa in a sequin dress that caught the sunset, Ethan in his usual smug blazer, both of them barefoot in the sand with wine glasses lifted as if nothing in the world could touch them. Their captions dripped with arrogance. New coast, same light. Freedom never looked better. But what they thought was freedom looked more like desperation to me. They had fled Charleston under the weight of criminal charges, yet here they were flaunting a fantasy. I watched the comments roll in below the pictures. At first, the usual chorus of heart emojis and congratulations, but then something shifted. One account wrote, "She stole my capstone project at USC in 2017. Another chimed in, "I worked with her on a group design showcase. She submitted my portfolio as hers." Screenshots began to appear, time-stamped documents, side-by-side images of sketches from years past that matched pieces Clarissa had later claimed as original. The thread grew longer with each hour. Former classmates, colleagues, even interns from firms in Los Angeles began sharing stories. It was like the floodgates had opened. My chest tightened as I scrolled, not from fear but from recognition. I was no longer the lone voice trying to prove what she had done. Others had lived the same betrayal, and now their voices were loud and public. By the end of the day, a blogger had written an article calling it the emerging designer fraud. The headline sat stark against the glowing photos Clarissa kept uploading from oceanfront restaurants. Beneath the article, readers debated whether she had built her entire brand on theft. Some defended her, but the tide was clear. The story was no longer under her control. I stayed up late at my kitchen table, arms still heavy in the sling, following every post, every thread. My inbox began to fill with messages from strangers who had read about me through whispers online. They sent sympathy, encouragement, and more damning evidence. A folder grew on my desktop, each file labeled with names and dates. Clarissa's pattern was no longer a secret. 2 mornings later, I got the call. Detective Harris's voice was steady. The Malibu Sheriff's Department had executed a summons. Clarissa was being formally called in for questioning. I opened Instagram again, unable to resist. Her latest photo showed her at a cafe along the Pacific Coast Highway, smile-wide, hair gleaming. But the comments beneath told another story. People weren't congratulating her anymore. They were tagging news outlets, quoting the article, asking about stolen work. When she tried to delete them, more appeared. That evening, someone posted a blurry cell phone video. It showed uniformed officers stepping into a Malibu boutique while Clarissa browsed a rack of dresses. Ethan hovered near the doorway, jaw tight, phone in his hand. The clip caught her face as she turned, recognition dawning. Her practiced smile faltered just for a second before she tucked her hair behind her ear and forced it back. But the damage was done. For the first time, the mask cracked. I played the video again and again, studying that single frame where her eyes widened and her chin trembled before she regained composure. It was a glimpse of the truth behind the shine she always sold. That night, I sat on my porch and breathed in the heavy Charleston air. Cicadas hummed in the trees the same way they had all summer, but something in the sound felt different. For months, I had been the one shrinking under her shadow, silenced by her manipulations and our mother's cold compliance. Now Clarissa was on the other coast, her glitter peeling in public, her empire wobbling under the weight of exposure. I closed my eyes and saw my grandmother's letter again, the words written in her looping hand. Do not let them write the story for you. It struck me that the story was no longer mine alone. It had become larger, a chorus of voices calling out theft and deceit. Clarissa had thrived by isolating her victims, convincing each of us we were alone. Now the walls she built were cracking and the world was watching through the gaps. News outlets began to pick up the story by morning. Local Charleston papers ran headlines about the charges filed here, while California blogs wrote about the investigation out west. Her name, once linked to fashion showcases and glossy parties, was now tied to fraud. I saved every article, every clip, every screenshot. They felt like small stones building a wall around me, one that kept the darkness of their lies outside for the first time. In my mind, I pictured her sitting at some Malibu rental phone buzzing with alerts, Ethan pacing beside her, both of them realizing that the Golden Coast wasn't far enough to outrun the truth. When I finally set my phone down and lay back in bed, I didn't dream of her laughter echoing through a wedding hall or the sting of red wine down my dress. I dreamed of silence, the kind that comes not from being erased, but from watching a storm finally catch the ones who thought they could live above it. And for the first time in months, I slept. Morning light edged over the rooftops when the emails began to arrive. The first was from Detective Harris with a clipped summary that felt like a long breath released. The university had revoked Clarissa's scholarship after reviewing the recording and the portfolio evidence. The National Design Showcase had withdrawn her application pending the investigation. A second note said California authorities had formally acknowledged the case and were coordinating with Charleston. None of it was loud or dramatic. It was measured and official, and it settled into me like quiet rain after a long heat. By noon, the story had shifted in the press. Her cheerful posts from Malibu were now threaded beneath headlines about academic sanctions and open inquiries. The comments that once praised her glow asked where she had really found her light. I watched from my kitchen table with my arm still in its sling and felt an ache that had nothing to do with broken bone. It was grief for the years I had let myself be small so someone else could look large. It was also relief, clean and sharp. 2 days later, a friend who worked downtown texted to say she had seen Ethan leaving his office early with a box in his arms. I did not answer right away. That evening, an email surfaced in a finance blog about personnel changes at his firm tied to undisclosed conflicts and compliance concerns. There was no need to read between lines. He had tied himself to her, and the rope pulled them both. The house was quiet when a small envelope arrived with no return address. Inside lay a square of silk from the original yardage I had bought for my wedding dress, cut with surgical precision and folded once. No note, no apology, only fabric. I held it in my palm and felt something unclench in my chest. It was the nearest thing to an admission I would ever get from Vera. She had chosen silence all summer. Now she sent material and nothing more. It was a surrender without words, and oddly, it was enough. Work filled the next weeks in the way only purpose can. I filed what needed to be filed and handed over copies of everything. Then I turned to the life I wanted. Threaded truths opened with bare floors, clean tables, and bolts of cloth leaning against the walls like friends waiting to be called by name. I hired 3 women whose eyes carried familiar storms and steady fire. We sketched and cut and pinned while an old radio played in the corner. Some days, my arm ached so badly I had to stop and breathe through it. The ache did not feel like defeat anymore. It felt like evidence of survival. The nonprofit signed the collaboration paperwork on a Monday afternoon. The campaign would be called Where You're Worth. Not where, where. The phrase sat between fashion and place like a small miracle. We shot the flagship image in a sun-bleached rail depot outside the city. The model had my height and the same stubborn set to her chin. When she turned and the skirt moved like water under the late light, I heard my grandmother in the back of my mind saying, "Keep your chin up." The photographer lowered his camera and said we had it. For once I believed someone when they told me my work was enough. The billboards went up 3 weeks later. Photos flooded my phone from friends and strangers who had become friends. Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Philadelphia, New York, and Los Angeles. The Los Angeles shot made me stop breathing for a second. The image rose above a busy street not far from the campus, where Clarissa had tried to claim what she had not earned. My dress cast its clean lines against the sky, and the tagline curved along the hem like a promise. I stared until tears spilled, and I let them fall. They tasted like salt and something sweeter. Charleston gave me one perfect evening to mark the turn. We strung warm lights over the garden behind the studio and borrowed folding tables from the shop next door. Wind pushed the heat away, and the air smelled like cut grass and early apples. People came in small knots, women from sewing circles, neighbors from my street, a couple I had fitted for a simple vow renewal, the nonprofit team with paint still clinging to their hands. Music hummed low from a speaker on the steps. Elena arrived late, standing at the gate for a heartbeat before she walked in. She wore a simple dress and carried a jar of wildflowers. When our eyes met, there was no grand apology, only something soft and raw passing between us. She pressed the flowers into my hand and murmured that she had listened to the recording, that she had read the articles, that she had been wrong. I nodded because there was nothing else to say. Sometimes proof is the only language people understand. Sometimes it is mercy. We ate lemon cake from paper plates and drank sparkling water from mismatched glasses. Laughter rose and fell like wind through the oak. For the first time since spring, I looked around and saw a life that fit me. Not a life handed to me or assigned to me or stolen from me. A life I had stitched back together with my own name inside the seams. When someone pressed a small mic into my hand, I almost refused. Then I remembered the hospital beeps, the boutique floor, the chapel bell, the long nights at my table building binders and burning paper. I stepped onto the flat stone near the gardenia bush and waited until the murmurs settled. I said that for months I had believed silence kept the peace. I told them it had never been peace at all. It had been absence, and absence can look like calm if you tilt your head and squint. I looked at the women gathered under the lights, and I felt the weight of the last year lift just enough for breath. Forgiveness is not opening the door again. It is setting down the weight you carried and walking away without it. The garden hushed. A breeze moved a strand of hair across my cheek. Elena wiped her eyes and pretended to look at the cake. Someone squeezed my shoulder. The moment did not feel triumphant, it felt right. Later, when the lights were dimming and people were slipping away toward their cars, I stood alone by the mannequins in the studio and traced the curve of a new bodice with my fingertips. The city outside hummed low and steady. My phone buzzed with a message from Detective Harris saying paperwork had moved to the next stage and he would keep me posted. I thanked him and set the phone down. Justice had its pace, and I no longer needed to chase it to feel whole. The dresses on the forms were proof that I had found another way to live. Before I locked the door, I opened the top drawer of the work table and laid the silk square from Vera beside my grandmother's letter. One was an ending, the other a beginning. Together they told the truth better than any speech. When I finally sat on the back steps, the night smelled of rain and cut citrus from the cake that lingered on the plates. I thought about the girl who had walked into Magnolia Grace, hoping for a perfect fitting, and about the woman who had walked out of a police station with a file tucked under her arm. They were both me. One had been broken. The other had learned how to set bone and make something stronger where the fracture healed. If any of this touched a place inside you, if you have ever been told to stay quiet so someone else could shine, I would like to hear your story. Leave a comment and tell me what you survived and how you found your way back. If you want more true stories about justice and family and the ways women stitch themselves together, stay with me and subscribe. There is more to tell, and I am not done speaking.